to serve you and to serve your church, to be involved in churches all over the world, in ministries of evangelism and church planting and missions, and we're just thankful for it. Today in particular, I thank you for Dr. Conser and Dr. Meyer, Dr. Norton, for their love of you, for their faithfulness to you, for the way that you have used them to bring glory to your name. And today, as we have the opportunity to think about some of the people and events that have been involved in the history of our school, I pray that you would be honored by what happens here. We commit this day to you and pray that you will be pleased. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, this has been a day that I have been looking forward to very much for a long time, because I've been involved here at Trinity in my role as president. I'm into my 4th year. And during these 4 years, and even before that, because I was a student here at Trinity, I have read a bit of the history of the school. And yet sometimes when I read the written accounts, and then when I get the opportunity to speak with people who were involved, the real stories seem to be much more interesting than the written histories. And knowing that some of the people that God has used most centrally in the history of our school still would be able to be brought together for a day like today, I've asked some of our people, particularly Julia Ketz, to try to get some of us together so that we could have for our archives a few of the episodes, the stories, the events from your perspectives about what has happened here at what is now called Trinity International University, and particularly Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so we have as a part of our gathering Dr. Kenneth Conser, Dr. Ken Meyer, and Dr. Will Norton. We hope also to be able to add to this some of the reflections of Dr. Olson, Dr. Arnold T. Olson, when I get the chance to go up to Minneapolis. He had hoped to be here with us, but health reasons have kept him from being able to join us. I think that the place where I would like to begin is with your earliest memory. And Dr. Norton, I think perhaps you may have the longest history with what was once called I think the free church schools.
Naturally, he's the oldest, so
Yeah.
he should.
I hope you guys will behave yourselves.
Yes. Well, no, I don't want you to too much. So I want this to be a time where not too much good behavior takes place.
Qualifies me then.
Okay, that's right. Dr. Norton, I wonder what your first memory or your earliest memory of our free church schools would have been.
Well, it goes way, way back to the times when the 4211 building on Hermitage and Berthoud was the center of life at Trinity. I was a high school character at the time, and two of my close buddies, Les Hedstrom and Frank Anderson. Franklin was the second son of the minister of the First Free Church, Frank W. Anderson, who was always on the school board in my lifetime. And these two were enrolled in the academy because it was a Free Church Bible Institute, seminary, Free Church Seminary, Bible Institute, and Academy.
All rolled into
One.
school.
Yeah.
Which years apart, which decade would that have been?
Well, that would have been in the late 20s when I was involved, because I was in high school at the time. Are you laughing with me or at me?
No.
Yeah, and every summer they would have, or every spring they'd have a Trinity Sunday. And people would gather from all of the Chicago area free churches at the Free Church School. Now, I said Trinity Sunday because that's what it was later on, but it was a Sunday afternoon when they had a special emphasis, and it was part or the heart of their public relations activity. And the corner lot was vacant, where the building still stands, as I understand, or has stood until recently, at 1726. And all that was vacant land. It was a park-like affair with a turn-of-the-century house where the meetings and the classes were held. And the platform for this Sunday afternoon meeting would be the porch of this old house. And then everybody would gather in this empty lot. Most of us were standing, as I remember it. But they would have a speaker and some reports and all that, and then the usual coffee and fellowship. And it's one of those nostalgic memories. But these kids were kids such as I was, and occasionally I would arrange to have the family chariot unloosed so that I could drive down there and pick them up and drive them and their girlfriends home from school. So it had a romantic touch to it too.
How many students approximately would you guess?
I shouldn't really make a guess on that because the enrollment was very small compared to today. But I tell you that Mr. Woodell, who was the principal of the academy, Free Church Academy, was a very well-educated man for those times. He had his Master of Arts degree in Greek from Northwestern University. And I remember talking with him once, and he said that he wrote his thesis on a Greek preposition. Now, you know, we haven't been known for Greek in the early days all that much, but this man came very well prepared. He'd been a school principal in California and knew his way around and understood, and he was probably the leading man when it comes to academic qualifications. Dr. Edwards was the president of the whole school, but he was the key person in the seminary at the time. And in those days, there was also another personality who had his PhD from Iliff Seminary in Denver.
Most liberal school in the country.
That's right. And Steelberg was, Dr. Steelberg was the one who had the leading degree. But he was in there after Edwards. Edwards was a missionary to China. When he came back from China, he took over the Free Church School, as I recall, while it was still related to Moody Bible Institute.
Right, there was that period of time, 4 to 5 years, when it
Yeah.
became the
Well, it was the Swedish department at
of
Moody.
Moody Bible
Yeah.
Institute.
And that was a great thing, too. Edwards was a graduate of Wheaton College. And that was a significant thing in its own right. And there was a lady at Moody whom I got to know later on when I was in administration at Trinity and would go out to Vashon Island in Washington, Anna Lindgren. Some of you have met her and knew her. She was a great devotional writer, and I sort of list her as the Amy Carmichael or the Elizabeth Elliot of the Free Church at the time.
Every Free Church home at that time had one of her
Yeah.
devotional books.
And she wrote such books as With Him and In His Presence. She was a school teacher from Sweden, and you had to be somebody to do that. She was very intellectual and had been a left-wing type of a teacher. And it was the minister of the Fourth Presbyterian Church who helped to lead her to faith in Christ.
Fourth Presbyterian here in Chicago?
Yes, sir. Timothy Stone, who was also president of McCormick Theological Seminary. And I got in-depth acquainted with her when she was living on Vashon Island, and she wrote a novel in Swedish called Esther Wingi. And I translated that from Swedish in English, and Moody published it. And it really gave her story of how she wrestled with the issues of the existence of God and came to faith through his ministry. And it's a very interesting thing to see how a radical personality like that came to faith in Christ and such complete and utter devotion. Well, she taught English to these immigrants who came to the Bible Institute from Sweden. And many of our people who were in leadership in the Free Church got their education in the Swedish department at Moody.
So almost all the students then were Swedish or Scandinavian?
Oh, yeah. I mean, would you take a Samaritan?
Yeah.
Now, Spielberg, he became president, what, in about 1950?
Yeah.
Didn't he? And continued on to Ludwigson for a couple of years there. Spielberg was an interesting person.
Oh, man.
He lived near the school.
Yeah.
And he was an O'Harite.
Well,
of the
extreme.
First order. I mean, he was an extreme Graceite.
And became
The president of the school, and this was in part, as you know, Will, precipitated some of the problems that we had in the 50s in relationship to the whole movement with the Vine Street Church in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I understand he left the presidency was some of this conflict. Ludwigson came from Wheaton to take his position as president.
I want to come back to that in a little while because I think we've had a lot of, what would I say, theological breadth, doctrinal breadth in the movement and in the school that would surprise many people. But Dr. Norton, it seems to me from the documents that I read that in those early days in the 20s, early 30s, that there was a close interrelationship between Moody and Wheaton and our free church schools.
Yeah.
Many of our pastors had graduated from Moody and Wheaton, and then we just those three names just keep coming up in terms of schools that somehow have been interrelated. Not
Well,
always
as
born
for
out.
the Swedes,
Yeah.
not for
Not
the
the
Norwegians, because they were up in Houston, Minnesota, and Minneapolis. Rushford, yeah, in
Yes.
that orbit up there.
And I think Dr. Olson studied up there. with
Oh,
them.
yes, that's
So when I
right.
get with him, I'm going to talk with him a little bit about that.
Well, he will have the in-depth on the history, the development, and the problems of, that was the name, the Trinity was up there in Minneapolis. And we were just a free church school down here. But you mentioned Wheaton. The interesting thing there is that Enoch Durness, in 1924, I believe, was graduated from Wheaton College. He was the son of C.T. Durness, the founding pastor of the Salem Free Church in Chicago. And I believe it was immediately after his graduation, he was made registrar at Wheaton. And for 40 years, he was registrar and became vice president of academic affairs. And here's the influence of the Norwegian Free Church on Wheaton College academic development. And this is something most people are not aware of. And this man, when it comes to the academic at Wheaton, he's the one who built that school up. And he was very, very into the Free Church. And when I went to Wheaton to teach, I tried to find out how many Free Church students were there to ride on your comment here on the significance of Wheaton and the Free Church. And I was told that there were about 400 Free Church students enrolled at Wheaton. I was not allowed to find out who they were because that had been done before and it was abused, and whatever it was, I don't know. And Durness wouldn't give me that straight down, but there was a very close relationship. It was the Free Church school for many years.
Well, I was just reading a thesis that's going to be presented at TEDS that says in 1929 a donor offered an endowment for Wheaton to take over the Free Church schools, which Wheaton was willing to accept, but our free churches were not because they were afraid we would lose our ethnic identity. But so close was the relationship
That's
between
right.
us and Wheaton. And
And
I
Wheaton kept the money, by the way.
oh, did they? Well, I think I would too, had I been there. But,
But you can see why Wheaton students went there.
yeah,
I mean, Free Church students went to Wheaton.
yeah.
There was a strong tie and relationship there. And Rockford Free Church,
Oh, that was their school.
I mean, it was flooding the place.
Well, that close relationship has continued. I mean, many of our finest students have come both from Wheaton and Moody.
Well-
And I went to both, and
Well,
came here.
There's a very significant theological effect of that too, that's sometimes lost. In the early years, the free churches tended to be Arminian, descended from the Lutheran churches in Scandinavia. But when they came over here, many of the Norwegians went to the congregational school, congregational seminary, a liberal but mildly Calvinistic and Reformed. And the Swedish group tended to become connected with Wheaton, Moody, and especially through that liaison with Moody and Wheaton. And as a result of that, were influenced greatly by the Calvinistic and Reformed tradition. And it's interesting to me that Dr. Olson went to the Trinity up in Minneapolis that was least affected by the Moody
Right.
and Wheaton affair, and he was an Arminian in his theology. And his whole group, the Norwegian and, I should say he is, the Norwegian and Danish group that sponsored the school up there tended to be much more Arminian. When I joined the Free Church in 1948, I joined the Norwegian and Danish group, which as a matter of fact was the Arminian group. And they didn't say you had to be that, but that's what most of them were. But the change came through these factors that we mentioned. And Will, you could say a lot more about that if you cared to.
And
Well-
just piggybacking on it, Moline Church, as you remember, Will, was divided deeply with the two brothers.
Oh.
Strombeck brothers,
Strombeck brothers.
both of whom wrote and were prominent business people. And that church was divided over the Arminian issue.
But they hung together.
Yes, they did. They didn't separate.
And this is a unique testimony.
Free church.
And
Yeah.
there were,
Being able to hold those
and you know,
together.
there were two major issues in the 40s and 50s, as I remember the 50s, and then in the 50s the third, but the grace movement and Arminian
Yeah.
position, and then in the 50s came the pre-trib thing.
That's right.
But those were the major issues, and that Moline Church was a microcosm of what the whole Free Church was.
And they both published, both brothers
Yeah.
published
On those
as
issues.
lay people.
Right.
Now, interestingly, some documentation shows that we pulled away from that association with Moody in the 30s because some of our Free Church people felt that they didn't want to be so closely associated with dispensationalism and with eternal security. Is that true, or?
I'm not sure. I have no reading on that myself,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting thing for some other MA student
That might
to
be
be
worth-
writing a thesis on. Why did they pull out of Moody? I rather think, you see, there was a Free Church school before, and J.G. Princell, the founder of
Yes.
the Free Church school, was the most educated man we had.
Did you know him?
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
He died in 14, and I was born in 50.
Okay.
His wife.
Maybe
his
a
wife-
bit
Yeah,
difficult.
His
yeah.
wife was a better theologian, they say, than he was.
Yeah, and she was a great writer, and she
Yeah.
gave continuity to this whole thing.
Right.
Mrs. Princell, she was an angel.
And,
Really.
and I edited some of his sermons,
Yeah.
and he was close to, if not a universalist.
He certainly
he
held
was-
some.
Well, let me tell you, there is something here that could be very interesting for some student to research if he has both feet on the ground. Because I think you could say that he was a universalist, but he was told to keep it to himself. And this is a very interesting thing. I know of nobody in the Free Church that has become a universalist in any way. And here's this man who had this conviction, but he was a very devout believer and stood for the Lord in every way. but he never, to my knowledge, made that an issue. And he gave great leadership to our school. And when he died, we had no leader like him. That's why we went to Moody.
And his wife was a good preacher.
Yeah. Which
She's
is
an
another
excellent
point I do
preacher.
want to talk about
Yeah.
a little later. Yeah. Dr. Kunzer, I think we'll come over to you. What was your first memory of your association with our free church schools?
I first heard about the free church, actually, and also about the school when I was an engineer at Albany Bible Camp, connected with Albany Bible College. And as an engineer, I collected garbage and drove the truck around the place and other things like that. Yes, it was a glorified title, but the duties were very, very mundane, I assure you. And there was a girl there from Arnold Olson's church in Long Island, not Long Island, Staten Island. And her name was not Irving Jensen, that was her brother, Marion Jensen. And she told us about the free church. And at that time, I had made up my mind that I was going to leave the Lutheran church. That had been a decision that I'd made before that. So in a sense, I was looking around. And so I was eager to hear what she had to say. And she told me about the free church and about the free church school, Trinity, 2 Trinities at that time. And I got, interested, though nothing came of it at that time until I had finished my degree work and had come out to Wheaton to teach, and another connections between Wheaton and Trinity. And then at Wheaton, I became acquainted with Dr. Dernis, who was really a powerhouse at Wheaton. He was rooted in the school, vice president of the academic affairs, and I would say more than anyone else, he determined the course of Wheaton, except for its finances. Its finances were determined by a board chairman named Fisher. But
His wife just died.
really?
Yeah.
Fisher's wife?
He
I
was
didn't
a
know
neighbor
that.
of my mother's.
Yeah. A brilliant lawyer and a well-to-do lawyer who believed that the way to keep a school true was to underpay its teachers so they had no place else to go. And that would keep them spiritual. And he didn't really practice that for himself. He had other ways of being spiritual, but he thought that the faculty would be much more spiritual if you kept them on the edge of starvation. Well, in any case, Dernis really was an immense powerhouse there, inside and academically. And through him, I got acquainted with free church students, many of them connected with Team Mission, and many of them who later became pastors and prominent lay people in the free church. And actually, I became sort of a faculty advisor to the free church folk there at Wheaton, long before I was interested in coming to the college or the divinity school. But because of that, about every year, they would give me an invitation to come out to switch over to Trinity. And I had always said, no, I like you, and I'll do what I can for you, but I don't want to leave Wheaton.
If I can write on this, we came home from Congo the first time. You came to Wheaton in what year?
In 46.
46. And we were home for 2 years at the time, and I learned of Ken Concert at Wheaton. And I told Ollie Bragg, who later became chairman of the board at Trinity, if he knew this fella at Wheaton, Ken Concert, who was a free church, he was in the Free Church Ministerial Association of the Norwegian Free Church, and he didn't know anything about him. I said, you better get him to preach sometime. And I don't know if you recall the first time you preached in the First Free Church in Chicago, but I was so anxious for Ken Concert to get into an acquaintanceship with the Swedish end of the Free Church. I didn't know what that would lead to, but I was so grateful that the Norwegians had latched on to a PhD in your field, and I felt we needed to know him, and he needed to know us. So that's another way that Wheaton had a connection.
I could see that.
In my study of the history of the Free Church, and by the way, I took Free Church history from this man, but but you know, there was an academic strength in the Norwegian church that was not duplicated in the Swedish. If you're being very frank concerning it, and part of that was, you know, they had an early tie to Harvard through the Congregational Church, and some of the in Chicago, you know.
That was officially the seminary
Right, right.
For the
for the Norwegian and
for the
Danish
Norwegians.
Evangelical Free Church Association.
And
Is that right?
And there is where, and we had more of the baptism of infants on the Norwegian
Oh,
side.
that's where it was.
That's where it was, and it came out of that whole milieu, you know. And in the 50s, as a pastor, I baptized infants, and that was not uncommon, was it?
And you see, there's a carryover so easy from the Lutheran Church, because in Norway, especially, they even today, they're still members of the church, but they belong to these small groups that they have, the Kretzes over there, and there's no problem. And then in the East Coast, especially where the Norwegians were so strong, that's where the Congregationalists even built some churches for them. And it's a very interesting thing. They set up a German department, a Danish department, a Swedish department, and a Norwegian department at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And T.J. Bach, no less, who was the director of the Evangelical Alliance Mission, did his studies down there at Chicago. And they also had one of the leaders of team, their resident treasurer, secretary treasurer, who was a CTS graduate too. So Ken's comment here is very, very significant in terms of the academic aspects of it.
Dr. Meyer, when was your first association with Free Church?
Free Church, actually what took place was Northern Baptist at that time had an undergraduate division that became Judson, and it was, you remember, Will, it was Northern Baptist Seminary, but they had a 4-year college program. And when I I started at Greenville and then went to Northern, and went to the seminary then there for a year and a half, and I went to my pastor, who was came out of the Salem Evangelical Free Church, Torrey Johnson and Bob Cook, and they were non-denominational, Midwest Bible Church, and I asked him, I said, I just don't feel I can go into the American Baptist Church. You remember the wars they were having then over the virgin birth and all. And he said, well, look at the Free Church. He said, they need young men, and they need young men who have gone to seminary. And so I came over the first day of registration in 1954, and never had been near Trinity, and registered, but still registered at Northern Baptist as well. And for the first week, went to both schools. I don't know how I rigged that one.
That's what you call Dubai, the
Yeah.
Italians.
But that's when and it was Torrey Johnson who got me involved in the Free Church, and we then later, we were married at that time, we joined the Bethel Church, Bethel Free Church, Bethel Community Church, right? And because there was a Bethel South as well. So that's where I first came in contact. And went to the seminary I took my last year and a half in 3 years, with a family. It stretched, and graduated actually 2.5 years, in 56.
And who was the president then?
Ray Ludwigson.
Yes.
And he had succeeded Spielberg. And Will Norton was dean at that time. Milford Cholin. And then and then you took over after Milford left. And I pastored the Glenview Church. That was a mission church.
You were at Glenview a long time.
I was at Glenview for 7 years, 7.5 years, and then went to Crystal Free Church, and then to Rockford, and then here. But my initiation was through Torrey Johnson.
Yeah. In fact, maybe it would be good just to get down the different roles that each one of you have played here at Trinity over the years. Dr. Norton, you've been involved in many different capacities here.
Well,
Obviously, you were a dean for a
when I
while.
was at Wheaton, I was a mop boy.
Okay.
So you begin at the bottom. I came to Trinity after speaking in chapel in April of 1950. We had been furloughed home for health reasons, and the family was in the South, and the Illinois Women's Missionary Society had been a strong supporter of Colleen. The National Missionary Society had been she had been their missionary, and the Illinois group knew her very well and invited me up to speak at their spring meeting. So I came up in April, and while I was here, how it was arranged, I don't know, but I was invited to speak in chapel by Ray Ludwigson. So I came and spoke and went back down south. And after a little bit, he sent me a letter, asking if I would come and start the missions program and teach missions. So in the process of conferring with the mission board, because we were still under the mission board, it was arranged that we do that. And at the same time, after we got there the first semester, then he asked if I could teach free church history. Well, a challenge is a challenge is a challenge. But when a challenge doesn't provide any literature, it was pathetic. I was interested and wanted to do something in this field. And I said, well, if you help me get material together, let's try it. And so he and I drove up in the Trinity station wagon to Minneapolis to get all of the Evangelistens, the old Norwegian papers that had been bound, and all the old Chicago bloodeds, because Ludwigson, had his doctorate from Iowa, and he understood scholarship and research and archives, and he agreed to be the archivist. And we put those in the back of the station wagon and drove back down from Minneapolis in a blizzard. The last weekend of March in 1951. So I had all those things to work with, which I couldn't get into because I was also in a doctoral program at Northern Baptist Seminary. But we got together what we could, and we began the teaching of free church history that way. Then I became dean of men in a year or so. I mean, they were really short, tight, and uptight on getting personalities to help them out in their administration. And then I became dean of education after Milford Cholin went with Gospel Light. He was the first dean of Trinity, really. And after that, then they had a 2-year hiatus when they were looking for a president. And who wants to do that? But I'd been a missionary and didn't have any money anyhow. So if they asked me to be a missionary here at home in this way, that was all right. So in 1957, I became president for 7 years until 64.
Now, was T.B. Matson the interim, wasn't he?
Yes, T.B. Matson was an interesting person because he headed up things in Minneapolis.
This would be between Ludwigson and
Yeah.
when you took over.
He was
officially.
vice president.
Okay.
And he
But-
was interim in that couple-year period.
Yeah, that's right. He did. But the reason for that probably was that he was the one who commuted for 2 years between Minneapolis and Chicago. And he taught down here after the merger, in the process of developing the merger before the new building was set up. And he was a very capable person. He was also on the faculty of the University of Minnesota teaching Scandinavian literature, which ties in with what Ken just said a little while ago about their having academic credibility and understanding.
During the 50s, beside Milford and Rachel and Will, there were T.B. Metz and David Anderson.
Yeah.
And David Anderson taught Bible, but David came out of the Norwegian
That's right.
group as well.
Yeah. And while we're on this, it should be pointed up, I think, that the minister of the Elam Church on the south side of Chicago was a Lundell, Lundell. He came. Yeah, he came from the potato country of Minnesota, North Dakota, up in the Fargo area. And in the meantime, he had gotten his college education. He was a minister of the Free Church and got his college after being in the ministry, and also went to McCormick Seminary. And for years, he took his day off at Free Church School in Chicago and taught theology on Mondays. And he's a very solid person, and I don't know that he got any compensation for it. But he was a theology prof for years until the merger came. In about 1939, he left the Free Church and went to Northfield and was your neighbor.
Northbrook Presbyterian.
Northbrook, yeah.
Village Church of Northbrook.
Yeah.
Was Presbyterian. I pastored Glenview.
Yeah.
And he was the senior pastor at the Northbrook Presbyterian Church. And Trinity since, and I think even today, has had some real ties. You remember we had a couple profs who were associate pastors there.
And what he did, after he went to Northbrook, he continued to teach at Trinity. And I don't know that the church knew about it, but I think that's a kind of devotion and a kind of openness. You know, some schools would say, hey, you went Presbyterian, forget it. And it also gives a little clue as to the openness of the Free Church at the time, although he was severely criticized. I was with him in a conference in Iowa in 1939, and he said, Will, you know, people are saying that I quit the Free Church because I was getting more money with the Presbyterians. He said, that's not true. But that was the summer that he made his transition.
It was interesting because he was in the ministerial. Glenview and Northbrook were, had one joint ministerial. And I remember the first time I met him at the ministerial, he had been pastoring. I was at Northbrook, and I had just come to Glenview, and I mentioned, I hear you have taught in the past at Trinity. I don't talk about that amongst this group.
Yeah, yeah.
So
What roles have you played here at Trinity over the years? You came here from Wheaton, famous story that I've heard about many times. But
Well, I was at Wheaton for 17 years, and during that time, I came to the school quite often. And after a certain point, then I began to get invitations, first to teach, then to be dean of the undergraduate school, the college, and Bible college, and then as a teacher of theology in the seminary, and eventually as dean of the seminary. And this fellow to my left over here, Will, was one of those who pressed the invitation to move to be dean of the seminary.
in fact, one of the things I'm hoping to clear up a little bit here is I have heard over the years that when you came as dean that Harry Evans was president, but actually as I read the chronology, that's not true, is it?
No, that's not true. No, Will was president. Harry was president of the board.
Okay. See,
Well, he wasn't chairman of the board at that time because he was on the board for 2 years as alumni representative.
But he was chairman when I actually came
Yeah.
in 1963.
but in reality, you were the president here when we
Oh,
brought
yeah.
this fellow on.
That's why in the
Yeah.
history that you published, there are some discrepancies there that I think you'll ultimately want to take care of.
The dates are not
Yeah.
all
I
accurate.
recognize that because, you know, I was a pastor at Arlington Free Church, and
Yeah.
Harry was pastoring there
Yeah.
when Ken came. So I knew that that probably wasn't the case.
Well,
So
he
you-
had abilities, but not all that much.
Yeah.
And I want to point up that
You want to expand on that one?
not now, because I want to tell the story first. I was so set on getting Ken Concert. I thought it is an utter shame. This fellow is doing a great job at Wheaton. He's a free church guy. He needs to be with us. One of my purposes when I became president was to try to latch on to every single free church person who was teaching, involved in academics, wherever. And I had my feelers out, my antennae out to get all these fellas, and I thought he is so close, he belongs with us. And I'd been in touch with him time and time again. And one Saturday morning, after we got this property here, I was on my way to the campus from Palatine, where we lived. And on the old Palatine Road, which cuts down right nearby here, there was a telephone booth here at, what's the old name of the crossroads? Half Day. And I just pulled over to that outside telephone. I thought, Saturday morning, I'm going to call this guy again. And I don't know if this was the perseverance of the saints that broke his resistance or what, but I mark it, whether he does or not, as the occasion when the balance was tipped in favor of coming to Trinity. And after that, I went over to your home, and we sat down a while and discussed the issue a little more clearly. But there was perseverance of the saints in the process.
And you had, during that period of time, you had some of the strongest individuals on that Trinity board.
Oh.
More so, I think, than we've ever had since. Franklin Olson.
You named him.
Just very, very strong individuals. I'll tell you, Will survived 7 years with boards that I would not have wanted to have. I can say that.
Yeah, you can, all right, you did. But Franklin Olson was also a Wheaton alumnus.
Yeah.
And so was Torrey Johnson.
Yeah, right. And Torrey got everything but his thesis in for his doctorate
That's
at
right.
Northern Baptist.
That's right.
Now, Ray Ludwigson was teaching at Wheaton
Yeah.
when he came over here.
Yeah.
So you know the time.
Yeah.
Then Dr. Concha, you came, what year as dean?
In 1963.
Okay.
And to show how powerful your influences were, Will, I had just that year been granted the first sabbatical that Wheaton had offered, with full pay for a year to do research. And I had a manuscript on Karl Barth's theology, about 2/3 written, and it sits on my shelf now, 2/3 written. I've never finished it, but I left there, and that offer to pay my expenses for a year, salary for a year, and came here as dean and then vice president of academic instruction at the seminary. And to finish the story of what I've done and the offices I've held, I left the role of seminary in 19, let's see, I want to get it accurate here, 1978. Yeah. And went to Christianity Today. But during my stint of 5 years at Christianity Today, I also taught at Trinity, taught at least one course, sometimes 2 courses in theology at Trinity. And then at the end of that time, I retired from Christianity at the age of 65. And I thought I was going to move in to the role that all my life I had longed for, namely of research and writing. I had a long list of about 25 books that I wanted to write before I died. And so I came back in the fall of 1982 and was teaching here for 2 months, and then in December, during Christmas vacation, the president that followed Will, Harry Evans, came to my house at my home and dropped a bombshell asking me if I wouldn't consider becoming president of the college. And naturally, to my way of thinking, I didn't want to be, and really said that I wasn't very eager to do that, particularly if there were no radical changes made in the college, because I had felt for several years it had been going in a wrong direction. And one of those things that were wrong was that it was pulling out completely from the control of the Free Church. And that also meant pulling out without the Free Church students coming to it, and also without the finances of the Free Churches. And I felt that that this was destructive of the college. I know the motivations of the people who did that were good, but I think that they were utterly mistaken as to what the effect would be. And as a matter of fact, they were really going downhill academically and bankrupt financially. But when I told him what some of my problems were, he intimated that he thought maybe they could be changed, and would I be willing to meet the board?
And New Year's Day breakfast.
Yeah. So I met the board, and we discussed some of those things, and it was fairly obvious that though many of them were not really all that interested in the Free Church, they saw no future for the school, that it was really going to go bankrupt and go out of business. And in the light of that, they would rather that it would go back into the Free Church. And so they listened to me, and there were some who were very loyal to the Free Church, still on the board of the college. Remember, at that time, college and the divinity school were thoroughly separate, and Ken was president of the divinity school. Well, in any case, I definitely got interested, and then I felt that there were two people that I had to communicate with and level with before I did this, because one of my requirements was that it move back immediately into the Free Church, if the Free Church would have them. And one was Ken Meyer here. So I talked with him. Would he have his support? And I guess it's no great secret, I made plain that at 65, I was not due for a long-term presidency in the school. They asked me first if I would be willing to accept a presidency pro tem. And I said, no, I don't want to be acting president. An acting president has no authority. He can't do anything. If you want me at all, you have to take me as president and put me in charge of things. And they readily agreed to that. They saw the good sense of that, because it was a radical change that was going to come, and it needed somebody to work on it. But I talked with Ken and told him that I wasn't staying long, and that one of my motivations would be for him to move across the street too. And I wasn't asking for a commitment now, because I felt by moving into the college, I was risking being the final president who presided over its absolute bankruptcy. And I wasn't inviting him to that. But if there was a chance that it could survive, then my aim would be to bring somebody else in who could take over, and Ken would certainly be my pick. And then I talked to Dr. Arnold Olson, and that was you'll find out more from him. But that was an ambiguous conversation. I think I got the assurance from Dr. Olson that he would not fight the situation, and that he would support me if I came to be president of the college. But he thought it was a serious mistake.
Why didn't you talk to McDill, who was president at that time? Do you remember why?
I may have talked to him, but he had no authority.
Yeah. And he was on that board that was...
Don't you dare.
No. No.
This would be one of the private
He's one of my
sectors.
dear friends.
Yes.
But he was on that Trinity College board while this thing was going down, and all of the...
Yeah.
And it's interesting because during that period, January one, you had that breakfast meeting, and you talked to me, I think, within a few days after. And then I invited you to, because you, even when you were at CT, you were part of Trinity Seminary. I mean, you
I
were
taught.
an adjunct faculty.
Sure.
And I invited him to address the seminary faculty to tell them what you were going to do. Remember that? And so he explained what he was going to do. Now, the interesting thing is Trinity College had 2 creditors at that time. There was a $2 million note coming due in February to Deerfield State Bank. And the president at that time was a man by the name of Meyer. And
No relation? and
not at all.
And no resemblance to you.
He talked in a high voice like this. And then the second creditor was Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, because in November and December of that year, they couldn't make payroll and at the college. And they had run out. They wouldn't give them any more money over there. And so we forwarded them $250,000 to make payroll for November, December. And in February, I was down preaching at a church in Florida near Tampa. And it was a Friday afternoon, and I got a phone call from this Meyer, President Meyer of the bank. And he said to me, I just want you to let you know, you were already president at that time. And here he was, he had some office, I don't know, but he was, I think, out in June of that year. Anyway, he said, I want you to know that we're going to call the note, they're overdue, and you're a secondary creditor, so we've got to let you know, and we're going to foreclose on the college in the next 2 weeks. Well, you know, this is news, okay? And there's a whole story on how the property was divided. That's another whole story that goes back earlier. But what I did at that point, I consulted our lawyer, who was a Greek fellow over here in North Shore, and he said they've got to give you as secondary creditor, as minor creditor, time to assume the $2 million. So I asked for 90 days to assume the $2 million. And I spent most of that 90 days raising money. And I got the last part of it, the Sunday before the Tuesday it had to be at the bank. And it was actually 2.24. And so we took the note from them, and Trinity assumed it, the whole amount.
It's the only thing that kept the school alive.
And I'll tell you the interesting thing about that. That man lost his job as president because it was revealed he had already signed a deal for our property with LaSalle Partners.
They wanted it to be foreclosed.
Yeah.
See, they didn't want it to go because they wanted to keep the assets and divide them amongst their friends.
Yeah.
This was valuable property.
Yeah, I'll never forget that man's face when I walked in and handed him a check, because he for sure thought we were not going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other story, you know, on that last Sunday down in Missouri, getting $150,000 in a church that had just come into the free church. But that's another.
Well, you were worried, but you can imagine, as president of the college, what agony I was going through during this time.
Now, you moved out of the presidency, it passed on to Dr. Meyer after a couple of years.
2 years, right.
2 years. But since then, you've continued to play roles here at Trinity.
Yes, I've continuously taught in the
Okay.
Divinity School.
Yeah.
I also taught at the college while I was president there, and also when I became chancellor.
Yes.
Because when I stopped being president and Ken took over as president, then I became chancellor for a while,
Yes.
which is a name that can be used to describe anything.
We've
Yeah,
noticed
I found that out.
You get to, Dr. Meyer is now chancellor, and what does a chancellor do? He chancels, right?
Yes,
And-
right. That's the only definition.
I learned from Ken that you do whatever the president asks you to do, right?
Exactly.
And you feel like, and then most recently have been involved as the founding dean for the graduate school
Yeah.
as well. So
And then when I left the seminary altogether, they gave me a title that my wife despised, but I appreciated. They made me honorary dean, or dean emeritus.
Dean Emeritus, yes.
And so I've hung on to that title. One other interesting thing to me, but of no great significance to the school, is that the board apparently voted me to remain on the Senate indefinitely. And I am still, though I'm completely retired, a full-fledged voting member of the Senate.
Right.
Now, I have never voted in the Senate, but I attend all the meetings, participate vocally more than most of them would like, but I don't vote. Same for faculty meetings. I have always attended the faculty meetings of the Divinity School, still do, but I never vote.
Yeah, and what happened when he went to CT, I kept that position of dean open, you remember, for a year, and Warren Benson was dean pro tem for that 1 year period. Ken went on sabbatical in 75, 76. He went
Right,
out to
75,
Princeton.
76.
And during that time, Walter Liefeld served as
Acting
interim,
dean or
yeah,
whatever.
acting interim dean. But my idea was, hey, you know, Ken may not like it at CT, and he'll come back. So then by 80, we had to make a decision, and our first choice for dean was Honer from Dallas. And he even went out to the Free Church Conference, and we presented him. And he got, and he got scared off. And after the Free Church Conference, decided not to come. Harold Honer did. So then we searched, again started searching, and we went to Walt Kaiser. And then Walt served as dean for 10 years.
Dr. Meyer, let's move to you. What roles have you played here? We know that you went to school here in the 50s, or down in Chicago, and then...
Well, then of course, I was pastoring at Glenview, and was on the alumni board, and the alumni board didn't have any function to say. But during that time, the chairman of the alumni board was allowed to come on the board of directors of the school, and that was Harry. Harry was the chairman of the alumni board, and so he came on to the board. And I served on that, I think, 2-3 years. And it was the transition time when we came out here, 60, 61, 62. Then I had nothing to do with Trinity outside being a pastor and alumnus until 69, when I came to First Free Rockford, which at that time was probably the key church in the Free Church, Fullerton and First Free. But Fullerton didn't support the Free Church work like First Free did. You know.
And still doesn't.
But so I came onto the board of the school at that time and served as chairman half of 72 up till my term ended, my second term, you know, you had to get off, in 74, because I filled out a short term in the first one. And so as chairman, I ended the chairmanship the year at the time when the schools divided. And that was an historic conference. You were there. I don't know if you were there, Will, or not, in 74. There were a lot of things that precipitated. It started back in 1972 when the school was having such tremendous financial problems. And we were near bankruptcy. A group was brought in, that Harry brought in, of 3
Stooges.
3 or 4 academicians.
Okay.
Who
Academic stooges. I'll admit.
Yeah.
I'll admit that they were academic. You'll admit that they're stooges.
one of whom was a Christian, Eastern Baptist.
Yeah.
Who, we won't go into that. But they came in to do a study on what should happen to save the schools. And the seminary faculty, remember there was a group of 3 that came in with, that came into the board and asked for the college to be either closed or separated because they felt the college was pulling us down. At the same time, the college representatives came in and said, you're spending too much money over at the seminary, we think you should close that. So this group came and said they need to be separated. And the seminary should stay with the Free Church, and the college should stay independent and develop their own constituency. And the college at that time was about 6, 7, 800.
Oh,
And
up in the,
up-
above 800.
Above 800.
Those were the largest enrollment numbers we're
Seventy-
beginning to
74 to
approach.
Until just
78.
very recently, yes.
74 to 78. And the seminaries, when I came in 74, I left the chairmanship, and that's an interesting thing, because we as a board had to decide, once the Free Church approved the separation, the recommendation of this group, at that conference, we had to decide a president pro tem for the seminary. Harry never told anybody, except his very, very closest, I'm sure, what decision he was going to make, which school. I thought I knew as chairman, because I knew where his heart was, and more than that, I knew where Dorothy's heart was.
Sure, and I knew too.
Yeah, and he would go to the college. And,
He felt more capable on the college.
right.
He had never had a seminary training.
Right.
He was always, he was in command, but he was always defensive because he had no academic training, and all these PhDs and people with great academic dignity scared him.
Yeah. And then
Didn't
what,
scare you.
and then what took place was, well, you know, there's an interesting thing, because I didn't have a PhD, but I remember that first faculty meeting, I told them, this is a matter of gifts. And I have a gift you don't have, so I'm going to use my gift, you use your gift, and we'll get together.
Harry could have done that, but he didn't. He was always afraid of them.
But the interesting thing on that was, in 74, and this was not publicly known, we met as soon as that decision, and it was a 2/3 vote to separate. It wasn't a unanimous vote. And my wife was standing in the bookstore, which was right off that thing at Green Lake at the auditorium, and she was looking for some books. And Dorothy Evans and one of her friends and Harry came in and said, "Hey, we won. And they really, shouted or something. Well, when Carol told me that, it confirmed to me where he was going.
Sure.
And so that afternoon, he decided, he told the board, I'm going to be president of the college, you got to find somebody. We asked him, who do you recommend to be at least pro tem, if not the president? His recommendation was Harvey Bostrom for the seminary.
So he controlled both.
Because Harvey Bostrom had been placed over Ken in the last year and a half before that, okay, by Harry, okay? And Andy Johnson was on the board, Pastor Andrew Johnson. He at the same time was a student here. And I'll never forget that board meeting. We asked Harry to leave. And Andy said, you cannot do that. You will lose the seminary. You don't realize that he's Harry's stooge, okay? So what we did, we left it without anybody. And I left the chairmanship. I got a call, this was in third week of June. I got a call the second week of July. Would I come in and talk to the executive board about being president of the seminary? And I said, yeah, I could, if you want a divorced man, because my wife will never come. You know, and I had been only at Rockford 5.5 years, and we were having a great time. That was a great
ministry.
Oh, boy. And, they had more money than they could use, and I knew what the situation was here. Well, I decided then that I would do it on an interim basis and serve the church and here, 2 days a week at the church, 3 days there, 3 days here. And I did that until November. And then I decided I just couldn't divide myself this way, and made a prayerful decision. And Norris Aldine was my best friends, and the Aldines have a whole history in the school.
Mm-hmm.
But, and we prayed about it, and he said, as much as I'd like Dad to stay here at the church, he said, I think you should go. And I prayed about it. Carol submitted to my authority, and I said, okay, we'll do it. But you know, the interesting thing was we were nearly bankrupt.
Oh.
I'll tell you, the first thing I did when I became interim was try to find out where we had a line of credit. I found out we had none and could not get any.
Nobody with any brains would lend us any more money.
I traveled for the first year and a half on my personal credit card, and was not reimbursed for it because we didn't have any money as an institution.
As president of the college, I had my own credit card. The college, I don't think, could have gotten a credit card for me.
Now, But what happened was, the free church, the schools were, it doesn't sound like a lot now, the schools were about $1.1 million in debt, the two. The free church decided that the property would be divided, the acreage, 1/3 to the seminary, 2/3 to the college. Then the debt would be divided, 1/3 to the college, 2/3 to the seminary. So here we're sitting with 1/3 of the property and 2/3 of the debt. You know why Harry went that way and not this way. But you know, by '78 we burned the debt, and God blessed. The college never got, in those years, never got what they anticipated of financial or support from students outside the free church that they thought they would. And there was a pivotal time in there, and I don't know if we should talk about it. Yeah. Dorothy's death? Dorothy, okay.
We're rolling with
Okay,
this. so.
her death.
They will edit it, and I hope that we can have a veto over some things.
Yes, well, we'll see.
But in Dorothy's death, and when Harry remarried within about 8 months, and what happened, he married a lady, a free church lady who had been divorced a number of times, and you remember the
Twice.
stir. Yeah. You remember the stir that caused.
Oh.
And the enrollment and funding. There were some other things that were a problem. In fact, we at one board meeting discussed on the seminary side about changing the name of the seminary, because everything that was happening over on the college side, we were getting blamed to it, you know? And we came that close to changing the name of the seminary because of the poor reflection that we were getting from that side. But it started going down at that point on. And I think Harry lost his integrity amongst the free church people on that.
Yeah, he also lost his enthusiasm for the free church.
Right.
Through this group of stooges that I referred to earlier, from North Central and various corners that came here.
Called
Yeah.
something.
Well, in any case, they really changed his theological attitudes and his ethical attitudes. And he became a person who, instead of standing basically for what the free church really had stood for in the past, changed his own views, and he no longer fitted as a true representative of the free church.
Well, I had the privilege of pastoring a couple of his children, and I do know one of the things that's continued to live on for Harry was the feeling that the free church held authority over the schools, but would never really support the schools. And I think there has been a bit of an edge that's carried on for
There's a
years
truth,
about
and,
that.
and you know, there is a truth to that. I suffered with that for 21 years.
Tell me more.
You suffered with it.
So I know that
But we faced a financial crisis in '74. I remember going to the bank and asking them if they would restore our loan, and they said no way. You know, and that's when we started the TOP program, the Trinity Opportunity Loans. You know, and borrowing from our own people to have a line of credit, as such. And then we had another crisis with the college in '83, '84. And we came very, very close to closing the doors at that time. I think you met with Harry January '83, became president then, and
Yeah, at the end of '82.
'82. And in fact, the enrollment of the college at that time, John Aker was the the admissions director,
Right.
and had never done that in his life.
No.
And I think it was just over 300, the entire enrollment in the college.
Right, that's what I've seen.
I have a couple of incidental things that aren't too important, but might shed light on certain aspects of the history of the school. When I came as dean, I insisted that I should be a member of the board, which is very, very odd, and you'll remember. And I talked with Will about it first because he was president, and normally the president is a member of the board. Anybody else is invited, but not a member. But I said, no, I got to be a member of the board. And my reason essentially was that I had learned at Wheaton that if you're really primarily interested in the graduate school and the president is really interested in the college, that that the graduate schools programs and new faculty members and expenditures outlined in the budget don't get presented as directly and powerfully as they would be by the person who is immediately concerned.
They call it the stepchild syndrome.
Yes.
Right.
Well, in any case, I didn't want to be a stepchild or dean of a stepchild seminary, so I insisted that that must be the case. And I don't remember the exact year, but this group of people that came in told Harry and the board that this is nonsense. You don't want a dean of the seminary to be a regular member of the board. And he convinced them that that was not so. So I went to Harry and I said, well, this is a new job. I just don't automatically remain dean. I've got to weigh whether or not I will remain as dean in the new role where I could very easily become a stepchild. Well, I waited, but it seemed to me, after considering it, obviously, that that there was enough at stake in the seminary so that I should stay there, even though my pride was hurt quite a little bit.
Back up a little. In 72, 73, when Olson and Helene came down to the bank and assumed control, remember?
Mm-hmm.
In what Harry called that raid, and came out on campus and said, you know, we're taking over, and all of the vice presidents resigned.
Yeah.
You didn't.
No.
Okay, and he resented that you
Harry?
did not. Yeah.
Oh, I should say he did. Harry and I had been very close friends ever since he was in high school. I had met him up at the camp in Lake Geneva,
Right.
and had carried through the relationship. So I felt very, very close to Harry. And during my early years, when he was president, I was close to him.
Yeah.
And we had a good relationship, except that he was terribly hard to get decisions from. Just the opposite of this guy. Working under Harry, I had to scheme and plan and do everything under the sun to get a decision on the budget. And then once I got a decision on the budget, then it was clear sailing. I always was very, very faithful to obey the budgeted items. But getting the decision was the hard thing, and I had to fight like tooth and nail to get that decision.
David Johnson, who was vice president of business affairs, when he left to go to Wheaton, said something very interesting to me, and comparing Harry that he worked for and me. He worked for me for a couple of years. He said the difference between Ken Meyer and Harry Evans is this: Harry makes 5 decisions a year, 5 of them good. Ken Meyer makes 100 a year, 50 of them good. But
There's a corollary that's very necessary.
But the 95 that weren't made are on the other side.
I'd actually heard that you made 5,000 a year, so.
Well, yes, but there's another thing that you should have said about your making decisions, and I agree with that exactly. You make decisions 25 every second, or you're capable of doing it. But he also has an ability that very few people do, and that is to change his mind. And he was big enough to do it. And that took away the curse, in my judgment, of these immediate, quick decisions, some of whom were good, and some of which were good, and some of which weren't. Now, do you mind my saying that?
No. But I'm going to tell you. I'm going to
Cut.
No. I think that's. You know, I since I retired, I've done a lot of self-evaluation, and that is me. But decisions were at least made, and that was the contrast, I think, between Harry and myself. But in that time, when that raid came, you were the one that did not resign. I was on the executive board. In fact, I was chairman of the board. And we had an executive meeting, and I've never told you this. You may have heard about it. And I just told the president today. We had an executive board meeting right after that happened. There were 5 people on that executive board, 3 pastors and 2 lay people. And I won't name them. 2 of the pastors are dead, and the 2 lay people are living. Harry came in and asked us to endorse his releasing you as dean. Did you know?
No.
Okay.
But I'm not at all surprised, because he was my enemy right down to the very core.
And he felt that you had not backed him, you were insubordinate to him, and that you were plotting behind this thing for Olson coming down. And the vote was 3-2. The 3 pastors voted against his proposition, and the 2 laymen voted with Harry.
Mm-hmm.
And
Pretty close.
I didn't think he knew about this
God
thing.
is in control of this.
Yeah.
You know, I want to come back to that period a bit, but maybe we can pull all the way back. Yeah, I'd like to pull back a little. One point in our history that remains fuzzy for me. I mean, it's one of the big points in the history of Trinity that I hear about the event itself, but not much that surrounds it, is the famous merger in the 40s, where we have the Norwegians and the Swedes coming together. Do any of you have much recollection of that period?
For my time, but it was 1950.
No.
Yes.
No.
1950 they came together.
Excuse me.
They started talking.
We came home in 1950 at Christmas, and they already had merged in 49 because the merger of, we came home in 49 at Christmas. In the spring of 50, I was invited to the seminary, reconstructed, the merged seminary, and it was in June of 50 that the denominations merged. And the strategy was merge the schools first. And you got the schools merge, you got the merger idea in the head. And to do that with Swedes and Norwegians. See, what most people don't know is that Sweden controlled Norway until 1905. And now you have this great revival movement going on all throughout the 19th century in both countries. And Norway is under Sweden's rule. The king of Sweden was also king of Norway. But the remarkable thing is that in 1905, when Norway became independent, there was a great revival going on in both countries. And here was a country that became independent without one shot being fired. And if that same spirit might have carried over more effectively when the immigrants got over here, we might have had the merger 30 years earlier. But the point is, they took up for what they left in Norway.
Before 1905.
And
the
so,
Swedes were the desperate enemies.
you know, I read in the Chicago Bladet time after time, and in the yearbooks in Swedish, that the Union Merger Committee had met and had come to no decision. They talked merger for years before it finally came. But now to get to the merger of the 2 schools, if I could give a little background on how I had an experience in this, not knowing that there was going to be effected a merger. I told you that T.B. Madsen, while we were still on furlough, would come down on the train from Minneapolis, teach, and go back, and that was part of the pre-merger process. Well, we came home on furlough in 45, and in October, I had my first missionary conference up in Wisconsin, and T.J. Bach was there, which was part of the Free Church, because TEAM was really the Norwegian Free Church mission organization. And he was there, and he and I had always gotten along since before we went to the mission field. He was a very, very dear brother, and he in no way fits into any of the conflict thing that we've been talking about. But when that conference was over at, it has, what's her name comes from there, missionary to Hong Kong in Wisconsin. Well, that's beside the point at the moment. I went with them by car to Minneapolis. And while I was there, I was asked to speak at the university group at the University of Minnesota. Well, there were 2 people present there who became Free Church missionaries. Eleanor Johnson went to Congo for a bit, and Roger Anderson, who went to Hong Kong. But at the time, Roger was a pre-med student, a pre-law student. And as I got acquainted with him, and I kept looking at him And I wondered now, I was a pre-law student at Crane Junior College in Chicago. And I thought, now, what if the same thing happens to him that happened to me? That finally I gave in to the Lord to go into the ministry. Where is he going to seminary? And I had real anxieties here. Now, you mentioned Torrey Johnson. He's a free church guy. Now, he really carried on the free church tradition by pastoring the Midwest Bible Church, because that's an independent church, and that's what the free church was. What a lot of people don't really understand is that F-R-I, free, in Norwegian and Swedish and Danish, that means independent as well as free. But these early fellows transliterated that. And so the name became Free Church in the idea of being independent. And if they'd have done that early on, the IFCA wouldn't have much grounds for being the independent fundamentalist churches, because we were already independent. And that's what it was. But I knew of fellows like Torrey. One of them was the oldest son of the district superintendent in California, Lindquist. Stan Lindquist's older brother. Stan was on the faculty, I think, when you were at Trinity. And he took his PhD in psychology at Chicago and was with us for a number of years. His oldest brother, there's no other place to go but Princeton. So he went from California to Princeton, became minister of the big Orange, New Jersey Presbyterian Church. He was called from Orange to Hollywood and became the minister of the Hollywood Presbyterian Church that really put that church on the map. And I thought, what in the world's wrong with us? Free Church is supplying all these other denominations. Right. They're going to these other northern seminaries. That's where Torrey went. Princeton, that's where Lindquist went. And not only that, but there was...
Where this guy went?
Yeah. There was another one.
Bible church. Right.
There was another one, Johnson, I can't remember his first name, who was at Wheaton. His father was minister of the Denver church, and he went to Princeton.
Well, I know of three men from Summerdale and Edgebrook, the former, what was the former Edgebrook church name? Lakeview, that went to Princeton. One ended up in his last years before retirement as pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Naples, Florida, and Palmer. And he and two others, same era, they both went to Wheaton, and then they went to Princeton. So, there was a connection.
So here we are. Free Church is supplying other denominations when we so urgently need second-generation free church leadership. I sat down that fall and wrote a letter to Dr. E.A. Hullingham, the president of the Free Church. And I pleaded with him in the light of my experiences of these other people to please supply us with a school, a seminary, that will challenge and attract and draw university graduates. Well, they began having this kind of thing occur from Minneapolis, T.B. Matson coming down. And lo and behold, we saw the news in the Beacon that the schools were going to merge. Of course, we're out there in Congo now, so we don't know what's going on. And I came back here, this was one of the great answers to prayer for me, because I couldn't go to Free Church School when I finished Wheaton. I mean, it wouldn't be necessary, for one thing.
Well, we didn't have a seminary.
Well, we didn't. We had a thing that was called a seminary, but it really wasn't.
First 2 years of college were required at the best period in that seminary career.
The merger.
Well,
That was after the...
That was
that
a Bible college when we merged.
yeah, right.
Not a real college.
And then they offered, beginning in 50, they offered the THB. When I came here in 53, I think it was the first year they offered what was the BD, which later, in the 60s, we had a chance to exchange that for an MDiv.
63 was the first year where we began to require for the following years a full college course.
So it merged then as Trinity Bible College and Seminary.
Trinity Seminary and Bible College. That's the way it was. And I was so gratified at that because to me this was what you have asked here, a clear evidence of God's work in our school's history.
And you know, the merger, interestingly enough, Arlie Bragg was pastor at Summerdale, and I used to play golf with him every Monday when I was in Glenview. We used to go through the history time and time again. But Arlie, at the merger, they ran a Norwegian candidate and a Swedish candidate, from Norwegian church to Swedish church. Arlie was the Swedish candidate, and Olson was the Norwegian candidate, and Olson won.
Well, remember, there were only less than 3,000 of us Norwegians, and there were almost 15,000 of you Swedes.
But you know, there was another issue, and that was the missions issue, because the Swedish church had their own mission society, and the Norwegians did not. They used teams.
That's right.
And I remember when I came to First Free Rockford in '69, we had our missions budget divided evenly between team and free church.
And the interesting thing is that when we became missionary candidates, Elmer Johnson, pastor at Rockford, was chairman of the Free Church Mission Board. He was also on Team's mission board. The secretary of the mission board was Frank W. Anderson, my pastor, and he was also on Team's board. So there were...
Ernest was a member.
Yeah? You mean
Enoch.
Enoch? Oh, he was on there forever.
They didn't have terms of office.
It is interesting, as an answer to prayer to that kind of a school in the 50s, as I look at it, the numbers of students that we had here at the seminary were small, but the graduates that came out in the 50s have become significant leaders in our free church.
Well, you go back now, last September, we had a reunion at Pembine, Wisconsin, of all of the Congo missionaries. And let me tell you, there were 40 people there plus. And it was a great experience to see these retired missionaries. And many of them were from those early years in the 50s, the Lashbaus, the Faulkners, and
Classmates of mine.
yeah, and to see this now, there are a number. Roger Anderson is now retired, and he's one of those early graduates of from Trinity in the seminary, because he did come to the seminary and went to Hong Kong as a missionary.
We only had, when I was in the seminary in 53, 54, 55, 56, we only had probably 35 students. And it was even maybe a bit lower in 60.
Went down to 31.
And the college was a couple of hundred at that point. But, we had a great faculty in the 50s.
Exactly,
You know?
and this is, I listed these.
I didn't get a bad education. Compared to Northern, I thought my faculty at Trinity was every bit as good.
Well, we had Doug Young, PhD from Brandeis,
Bob Culver.
who was a dean and also Old Testament prof. Culver was there for a while, and we had Milford Sholin. And Milford Sholin was one of the great teachers. He didn't have a doctorate, but
He was a great pastor.
this is very important. The Christian education in the Free Church owes everything to Milford Sholin. And he got Marge Soderholm in there, who took her M.A. at Wheaton, and she did a big job. We got Fagerstrom, you can't believe. Vi Youngberg was secretary, but she also participated in Christian Ed. Fagerstrom, and one or two others. There were about...
You had Ray Ludwig. And I took my Old Testament from Ray.
President and
Yeah,
Old
and he
Testament.
taught. Yeah, we used to meet in his office.
PhD from Iowa.
And the weakest area we had was mission. Well, in preaching. No, not missions for you, teacher. But in preaching.
Yeah.
We had a pastor, Frost,
Yeah.
remember, who taught preaching, and I came from Northern. I was so thankful I had my homiletics.
Well, you had a big
And
guy there in that.
Lloyd Perry,
Yeah.
you know,
Kohler.
and
And
Whiteford,
Kohler,
and
the
Kohler,
two of them.
yeah.
They
But
teamed up.
Kohler, when I was there, did not teach much. He was president. But it was Weitzel and Perry. And
Evangelism, yeah.
yeah, and I had my homiletics from Lloyd.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and move it a little bit forward there into another one of those watershed times of Trinity's history, and that is the founding of TEDS, that period in the early 60s when Dr. Conser, you came over, and I know some painful things probably too happened when you left in 64, I believe.
Yeah, I left in 64.
But in
That's
giving birth to TEDS, was that on your mind, or was the idea of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School something that originated with?
The name came from Ken Conser. And he says, look, we got Yale Divinity School. If there's going to be a thing, let's name it the way it ought to be. And for me, you know, on the background of Raj Anderson and having a seminary that counted, you know, this indigenous methodology is what I stood for in Congo all the time. Here we have an indigenous dean of the seminary now who wants this name change, and that's for me. I'm for it.
Yeah.
But
There was a principle behind that,
Yeah.
obviously. Historically speaking, in the United States, seminaries are independent institutions. Divinity schools are seminaries associated with a larger university. And this school was associated with a college, felt that its liberal arts program was important, and it was joining the two together. And in my judgment, the best way to affect a culture through a seminary was through a seminary that had to rub shoulders with the liberal arts crowd, the university crowd. Unfortunately, in many of those other schools, it turned liberal. But if it didn't do that, it became a stronger seminary or divinity school by the association with the liberal arts and sciences, with the lay people getting their education with whom they would be ministering as pastors later on.
Well, sometimes I've wondered, Dr. Conser, here you were at Wheaton, settled in a place, had a sabbatical coming. You get this crazy call on a Saturday morning from Dr. Norton. What kind of vision was there in your mind? What kind of burden from God was in your heart that brought you over here? It couldn't have been the financial stability or the reputation of Trinity at that
No,
point.
because I didn't come here with any
Yeah.
significant advance to my salary.
I don't know that he knew too much about our financial instability.
But I remember the ministerial that year when you addressed the ministerial on the name change. And I think you put it so well that a seminary mainly is training pastors. For the academy trains pastors. But with Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, it broadens itself to master's degrees outside of an MDiv. And I think you sold the conference on the fact that now this is the broadening of what we want to do, along with the fact that we then have that connection with the college. It is also interesting that he wrote a paper, and I know you remember it, I think it was in 1970, a white paper on Trinity becoming a university, which we used as the model when we became a university.
And I've heard so many times about it, but have not yet seen this white paper. But I want to get a copy of that famous paper.
But-
I don't have a copy.
But, okay.
As a background to all of this, when I got to Trinity, my field was missions, my thrust was missions. And after all, what is there in the New Testament church but missions? And that's the whole thing that we're studying. And the mission church comes out of that particular thrust from the biblical emphasis. And so when we found a Bible college coming home on furlough, I was rather taken aback by that because I thought we could do, a little better. And the need in Congo was for teachers. For the first time in the history of the world, the Belgian colonial government said, okay, we will recognize Protestant mission schools if they meet our standards. And we had to have teachers who were degreed. Well, we have some birth pains here that go back to certain ministers in the Free Church. And I was bringing up to the faculty what these needs were. The board heard this. The board decided that it would be legitimate to expand the three emphases: Bible, missions, and Christian ed. That's what the first majors were, that we would expand the program to a 4-year college that would offer degrees in these three areas. Well, boy, it's like the walls of Jericho were coming down on us because
This was in the 50s, right?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
it was
Late 50s.
57. Well, it was while Milford Sholin was still there,
Yeah, that was,
because he was our real dean, who saw the vision of Christian ed and mission. You
He
can't isolate these three things. And God had led that we had this missions program.
yeah,
With-
he left in 57, I think. The
No,
year,
he
yeah.
left in 55. There was I came in after him in 55.
His influence remained even
Oh,
after
I
he
thought,
left.
I thought he was still dean when I graduated.
No, I
Okay.
came in as dean in 55 for 2 years, and then they asked me to take over. But the whole point was that while he was there, we were able to get the elementary ed program started. As a result of already having Christian ed, now we brought in a few extra subjects to meet the requirements of Illinois State for elementary teachers. That's what we needed in the Congo. And it's very interesting that Marjorie Woodell, the only child that the former principal of the academy had, she was up here in Skokie teaching. And she was in with Mr. Jordan, the superintendent.
And she was principal then
Yeah,
of the school.
she was
until
principal of a
died.
school, but so
Car accident.
early on, we were able to use her school as a base for our teacher education for, what do they call this? They go
Practice teaching.
practice teaching. And she was very much part of us in supporting us in this. The head of the Illinois Commission on Education visited Trinity on several occasions and was very, very empathetic, encouraging, and approved us. Well, I had lunch with Carl Olson on one occasion, the president of North Park College. Another lunch later on with Lundquist up at Bethel. And both these men, presidents of their respective schools, said, Will, how in the world did you guys in an unaccredited school get approved for elementary education? They had approval for high school, but not for elementary ed. I said, I don't know, we just went at it and did it. And that's our missionaries, the early missionaries of the 50s, went out with their teachers' degrees. And what a lot of our ministers didn't understand at the time, they said, look, that hasn't been approved by the conference, and that hasn't been approved by the ministerial. And I got some real rough feedback on this thing, that we were taking things in our own hands, under our own control. Well, the basis was already there. The conference was going to approve it, but you have to get moving if you're going to do it. But it was part of what you were calling the birth pangs of this whole business.
In the 50s, in the late 50s, as a part of the alumni, early 60s, we did a survey at that time, and I don't know where this survey is, and I don't even know if there's alumni records back there, of how many of our pastors in the Free Church had seminary degrees.
Oh.
It was less than 10%.
And how many
in
had college
61.
degrees?
Oh, we didn't even ask that question, but less than 10% had seminary degrees.
And you see, this was one of the problems. Here these young people are coming from their churches, and they're beginning to come back with a BA in Christian Ed, BA in missions, or a BA in Bible, and they were a threat.
They were better educated than their pastors.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
And some of us young guys at that time who were coming out of seminary were a threat to some of the guys 20 years older, because we were getting calls to churches that they wanted and should have had. It was that clash of generation. But there's an interesting thing, Will, between 50 and 58. and that is how many of the churches in this area, Chicago area, were planted by seminary
Seminary
students
students,
at
that's right.
Trinity. I did my D-Min paper on the 8 churches during that period started by seminary students.
But nobody looks on this. The emphasis in these days is church planting. Well, it's very remarkable to see that these students were going out on Wednesdays and on Sundays. Libertyville, Arlington Heights, Glenview.
Arlington Heights actually came out of the Salem Church, and they had a group of people starting. But it was Libertyville, Wakanda, Lake Zurich, Glenview, no, Addison, it'll come,
Well,
How about Evanston?
no,
no,
Evanston was historic.
that was so old.
That was dying at that
Oh,
time.
Yeah, rigor mortis.
2 more out. Wheaton,
That's right, Wheaton came along.
there were 8.
All
But-
started by involvement of
Students.
Trinity students,
Listen, Milo Lindell, as a
who's
student.
now executive vice
Yeah,
president. Yeah.
Milo Lindell came out when we started Glenview, and he came out on Sunday afternoons and helped visit. We had students from the college and seminary who would come out and go door to
Roger
door.
Anderson was one at Glenview.
Yeah, Roger Anderson started the Glenview Free Church and went to the mission field after 8 months,
Mhm.
and then I succeeded him.
Well, having pastored a very strong church, the Arlington Heights Church, I know that apart from
You
Trinity,
know who the first student pastor was there?
was a
Gordon Addington.
I know.
And Milford Scholin was involved in that.
Yeah, he was.
He basically wrote the Constitution and bylaws of that church.
That's right. In fact, when we changed the bylaws there, we had to go back to him to find out what on earth he intended with some of this stuff. So it was
It was
interesting.
very avant-garde stuff.
I want to move ahead into the 60s again, though, with Dr. Concert coming on and the beginning of TEDS. Out of that vision, what it was that the burden that God put on your heart, or the vision that He gave to you, that brought you to this place. Do you remember some of your thinking?
Oh, yes, I certainly do. And it wasn't a very, very simple, but rather a rather complicated sort of set of circumstances that really guided me, led me to do what I did. When I came to Wheaton from graduate school, I was really interested in seminary education primarily. And I was installed in the college and the seminary, but I very quickly moved over almost completely to the seminary, that is, to the graduate school and seminary. And it was a seminary, offering a regular seminary degree. And that was exactly what I wanted, only even at that time, I began to be interested in a graduate program, university-type program, and actually thought that Wheaton was the school in the country, evangelical school in the country, best equipped to move into a quality university sort of instruction. But then, during my stay there at Wheaton, the board at Wheaton changed its mind about the direction in which they wished the school to go. The reason for it, as nearly as I can fathom it, was that the troubles in the denomination that Dr. Buswell had gotten into remained after Buswell had left under Dr. Edmund, the new president following Dr. Buswell. And Dr. Edmund's policy was not to foster a seminary, because a seminary would immediately pose a rival to all the denominations, particularly the Presbyterian and to a lesser extent the Congregational and other groups that the college appealed to for both students and funds. They didn't really mind a college because they had a long tradition of new colleges being started that functioned inside the denomination or on the edge of the denomination. But a seminary is a different thing. That was too risky for for a Presbyterian church to support another non-Presbyterian seminary. And so the tendency was to say, let's not create problems in our raising students and funds from the various denominations we appeal to by starting a seminary and becoming a strong seminary program. Let's restrict ourselves to a first-class college. Moreover, when seminary students graduate and go out into various denominations, they become recruits for their own denomination. They don't become recruiters for Wheaton, financially, and oftentimes even for students. Therefore, if we graduate college students, they will go out and they will become supporters in whatever denomination they go into for Wheaton College, and they'll send students here. But you can't count on the seminary students graduating and doing the same thing. So how much those factors decided them, it's hard to know, but they were certainly important factors on the minds of many. And they decided to push the undergraduate program. And I actually switched my schedule of teaching in the school. I saw that the graduate school and the seminary was not really going anywhere. But the college was becoming stronger and stronger, academically and in other ways. And so I tended to switch my center of influence and my teaching to the college, the undergraduate level, teaching also some on the graduate level. And then when Trinity came along, I had still another factor. I found again and again on the college level that we would get students who had gone through grammar school, public high school, state universities and private colleges, and get a PhD at a secular university. And then they would come to teach as committed Christians psychology, sociology, biology, all the fields that go into the curriculum of a Christian college, but they didn't know anything about Christianity except what they picked up in their local church, which hadn't given them too much. And they tried to make an integration of their Christian faith, but they hadn't the basis in Bible knowledge nor in Christian theology, so as to enable them to make an effective and truly biblical integration of their Christian faith with their own discipline. Led to some, in my judgment, horrendous things. The head of the psychology department at Wheaton at that time was a thoroughgoing materialist in his psychology, believed in the true determinism of every human being. But he was a Christian, and he just sort of kept those things in his head. Yeah, separate. See, chairman of the department, and it just seemed to me to be a terrible, destructive influence for the attainment of a truly Christian integrated college education. And how could that be linked? Well, there are a lot of ways it could be linked, but so far none of them hadn't been especially successful. But I felt that the best way to link it was to have a strong seminary, turning out pastors who were educated and committed to biblical teaching, and biblical teaching on a level that really came to grips with the non-Christian thinking of our culture. And that prepared me for an offer from Trinity. And so when they came to me year after year to come there, I would always say no. But eventually, as Will knows, and Ken probably too, I thought, well, let's see how serious they are about the kind of seminary they want. You want me to come there? What kind of seminary do you want? The kind that I want is a very particular kind. And if you were really to do this sort of thing, I'd immediately get very, very much interested, because Wheaton, while it was committed to that at one time, along with a liberal arts quality education, had drifted back from it. And I felt that that drift was a drift in the wrong direction in our culture. I was happy at Wheaton, and I really, to be honest, expected to stay there the rest of my life. In fact, I think everybody there thought that I would replace Dr. Tenney as dean of the graduate school in 2 or 3 years, and that would be it.
You were chairman of the Bible.
Oh yeah, I was chairman of the Bible department and of the division of Christian education, philosophy, and Bible, all of them.
But the grad school always, I was at the grad school in 57, 58, and you could tell a lot on its emphasis on what building you were in. The grad school had that old dumb building. and
Buswell
that
Hall.
Was it, Buswell Hall.
And,
You know, and you could tell you weren't on the same level as the.
That's right. You
No.
weren't in the real swing.
Now, first meal that I ever had with you and your wife Ruth, she told me the story that when you first came over to Trinity, she said, Ken would be lying there on the bed and say, will we ever have a school here? Will we ever have a school? Because when you got in, there was so much that had to be
Oh.
built and started.
Oh yes, and we were near bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Well,
And I would come home at 1 o'clock after the board meeting, because I was on the board then,
Yeah.
and I would flop down on the living room in Davenport and say to my wife, I don't know whether we're going to be alive tomorrow or not. The banks could foreclose us if they insisted.
and this is the understanding, if we get the bigger picture, and this was my struggle as president at the time. I had been privileged under Peter Stiansen at Northern to be led into researching the revivals that created the Free Church in Scandinavia. He had written himself as a Norwegian Baptist from Trondheim. And this is something that most people would know, that he had done 2 books. One was his PhD study at Northwestern University, Garrett, on the history of the Norwegian Baptists. He wrote on the Norwegian Baptists in Norway. He wrote on the Norwegian Baptists in America. In the providence of God, I was commissioned and approved by the Field Council in Congo to come home here on our first furlough and do linguistic studies. The mission board approved my doing this because we were in a bad way. Now, you talk about the liberal arts, but this is one of our problems in the whole missionary program of the American church, that most of our missionaries were Bible Institute missionaries. They didn't have the broader liberal arts, and especially the study of man, the study of anthropology.
And the study of contemporary culture.
All right, on the American or the Western side, and to understand the ministry of missions in the modern milieu. So here I came home, and I was looking for schools in the Chicago area. After the war, there were no apartments for rent. We had an awful time. My family had to go down to South Carolina to the farm, and I was supposed to go to school. I couldn't afford, after I found out that Chicago was tied in with the old Indo-European linguistic program, which would have nothing to do with what we needed in reducing these languages to writing so we get the scriptures in them and learn how to preach in those languages. And as a result of that, I went to Chicago and interviewed this fella, and he told me the only place you can go would be Michigan, Indiana, or Pennsylvania. Well, I couldn't afford to do it with a missionary allowance like ours, and there was no place to live. So I called up Carl Henry. He was at Northern with Linzell at the time. And I just poured myself out on him a little bit because he had been at Wheaton when I was there. He and Linzell were 2 years behind in terms of their coming in as older students later. And he said,
39.
yeah,
My year.
we've been here in school for a week now. If you want to come over here, you better hurry. In the providence of God, I got in there, and I got into church history. And that's how I got into this whole background, to understand what this thing is. And as a result, our people were lay people. This was a layman's revival. And some of them in the early days, I met Frank Lindbergh. Did you ever meet Frank Lindbergh? And boy, I'm telling you, he was not very pro-clergy at all. But we still need trained clergy. And one of our problems was getting this humongous thing out of the mud of non-academia.
Well, you know, Will, there's another, we've mentioned a number of times how we were at different stages, almost every 10 years near bankruptcy. But there, you know, there's an interesting thing. The Free Church has always had an aversion to having the schools build an endowment. And McDill told me at one time, very strongly, I will never want to see an endowment built because the schools will, and he held that down, and Olson felt somewhat the same way, I believe, and because of the history of what had taken place with Harvard, Chicago, moving out of their denominational influence when they got enough money to be independent. And the fear was that if we had an endowment, we could loosen ourselves from the Free Church as such. And we were fought. I remember the board of directors of the Free Church in the 70s and early 80s when I asked to start a foundation so we could have an endowment, turned us down. And that was the rationale. You will become too strong.
Well, they did that before, that board meeting.
I know.
Because I brought it up in a board meeting, and I tried to use Wheaton. Wheaton was an example academically, but don't use Wheaton as example financially. And I remember the treasurer at the time, just in so many words, how you don't want to do that. And when Harold Helene made a statement like that, nobody else is going to contest it. And this was our problem. We were not given the liberty to do it. And we didn't have on the board men who really understood the basic principles of financing. Basic business principles. Yeah, financing an educational institution.
And the difference is Wheaton, there's a vast difference on their board, the board reaction and interplay. At Wheaton, the board controls Wheaton College.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And the president really works for the board at that point.
And when he doesn't, he's fired.
Yeah. And that board gets into, they don't only set policy, they get into management. My brother's on that board as vice chairman, I know, but they still do. Yeah. Now, here at Trinity, because of the fact we've always had a rotating board, no one can serve more than 6 years in their office. The historical line and the continuity line is kept by the administration, by the president. Over there, those board members at Wheaton have outlived a couple presidents, and they're still on that board, see? So here, the historical line is kept by the president and deans and the continuity, not the board, which means we have weaker boards.
Well, you do, but at the same time, my sad story was that I would go out in the hinterland and discover who the concerned people were. And I was quite concerned about having a balance on the board. Most of our people were rural, from the farms. We had no farmers on the board. We had very intelligent, successful farmers. And I made a list of the men who would be ideal for this. We had one educator, Les Lovedahl. And thank God we had one, you see. So I would make a list of some of those who could, because they're educators, serve. And when the time came for nominations for new board members to follow through on what Ken has been talking about here on the rotation, I present my list. But let me tell you, brother, somebody from headquarters would be in on that committee meeting, and the name would come up, oh, you don't want him on there. And where in the world does a president have the ability to develop the kind of a board that will be able to function in the context of what we're talking about?
It wasn't until Paul Cedar came that I had my nominees come onto the board as nominees.
In fact, I think for the archives, one of the things that both Ken and I would want to say is that probably the relationship between Trinity and headquarters is closer now than ever.
And I give a lot of credit to Paul Cedar for
Yeah.
that.
Well,
The other thing is that I don't know how it was with you, I found out who was nominated to my board in the May issue of the Beacon before the June election.
yeah. And we're not included, see? And there was a very studied effort not to let the president of the institution have any proper thing to say in this whole thing. And there is a lot of behind-the-scenes activity and never any forthright discussion. For example, I don't mind people doing that in a committee meeting, but why not say, now how can we build the strongest school? How can we have the strongest denomination? Now I want to meet with you and discuss the options and the possibilities for board appointment and election.
But see, the school has always been a threat to Minneapolis.
Beginning with A.T. Olson.
Well,
A.T.
it's more
Olson,
the personality than the denomination.
he wanted to run the thing.
He did.
And he couldn't do that if he had a strong board that he was only a visitor on. He needed a board that was weak and a president that wouldn't fight him.
Well, in fact, I was going to say too, do we need to have a break for a few minutes?
Yeah.
And come
The
back?
interesting thing is,
And
you won't go on the tape, you should. But when I was nominated to the